Hey friends, I'm Daniel Nesbitt, and in this video we're going to do a quick tutorial on what it means to draw quick, clean, proper paths when you're designing a letter. I got this question by the way of John, who had reached out, and primarily the reason he was asking about this wasn't just to do with a single weight, but why is that important, particularly when you start adding more weights or more styles to your typeface? So I just wanted to go through and pretty much just put together a quick video. What you'll see in this tutorial here will probably fall pretty well in line with how you would see me design letters in any of my other videos on this channel. But I'm going to slow it down a little bit, hopefully slow it down a little bit, and just talk a little bit more about particularly point placement and effectively why I'm doing what I'm doing. For the sake of this tutorial, we're just going to use the lowercase n, and the reason that I'm choosing that is it's a fairly simple character to work with. And we do get a little bit of the curve in there too. It's not completely like an O, but maybe if we have enough time I can go through and show that towards the end here. But more or less the same principles will apply in either case. So the first thing that we want to keep in mind is that generally speaking, the fewer points, the better. If you draw a curve with a lot of different points, that becomes a lot of different controls that you've got to worry about. That becomes a lot of different things that you have to focus on if we're going back and forth between two weights here. And in this case, just to help set the stage further, I am going to be working between a heavyweight and a lightweight as well. I'm just going to be starting with the heavyweight just because I'm starting with the heavyweight. You could start with the light too if you want. There's really no rhyme or reason or process to starting with one over the other. So we'll start with the first shape here, and obviously it's going to be pretty easy because it's just going to be the downstroke. I actually am using this in a typeface that I'm already working on. Not quite ready to show it off yet, but we'll just use my dimensions in the upper corner there as kind of my guide. So the first stem here is going to be 136 points wide, and then I'm just going to go through. And one of the key things that I'm always trying to do is make sure that my points line up to, in this case, my baseline and my X height. So a square is pretty easy because it's just got 4 points, and that's really all it needs. Pretty basic stuff. So the second thing I usually do when I'm starting an N out is I'll make a copy of the stem and I'll move it over and just push it off to the side here a little bit. Now, the thing to keep in mind is you've got to think about how you would write this letter. And the way most people would do that is the left stem would be a downstroke. And then either you drag the pen up or you lift your pen up and put it somewhere maybe about a third of the way from the top. And then you draw an arc, and then eventually it straightens out and goes back into a downward stroke, which means that these two strokes here are going to be the same width, is effectively what that means. Now, for that curve, I usually separate this from these two, and in some cases you'll see people merge these shapes together in various ways. This is really just the way I do it when it comes down to it. And again, there's many ways to go about doing this, but effectively what I want to do is just put a point where all of the extremes of the shape will be, basically. So what that means is, I'm just going to go through and draw and then explain this, is if we think about that curve there, you're going to have the leftmost side, the topmost side, and then the rightmost side, and then we're going to repeat that for the inside. So you'll kind of have a matching set inside and out on these shapes here. The next thing that I do once I have this drawn out is I'll usually go through and I'll just kind of line up some of these points here. And if you ever see me kind of bumping points around or bumping lines around here, effectively all I'm doing is just going in and making sure to start that my points are at right angles from each other. And when I do that, we'll see if sometimes it doesn't want to cooperate, but eventually you'll kind of see or feel it snap into place. Naturally, this is not going to cooperate with me fully today, but there we go. So when I do that, it's probably very difficult to see. I don't even know if I can zoom in very much on this to show it, but if you try this, and this goes for any version of glyphs, But as I move this, you'll see like a little red dot appear on the opposite side. So we'll just go through on the top here, and it looks like that gets me straight across there. So now I have two parallel lines there that are running 90 degrees. The other thing that I'm going to do is I'm just pressing spacebar to go into preview mode here, and where it overlaps, it's actually creating a hole here. If we were drawing an O, this would be great, but we're not. So what I'm going to do is, usually I would do a shortcut command on my keyboard, which is Command Shift and R. But what we want is we want to correct the path directions. And if you go under paths and hit correct path direction, now when I hit the spacebar, now this all becomes one shape. So we're getting there. The next thing that I want to do is I'll just kind of move this piece around a little bit here too. And it might be difficult to see, but I want this all to be on one plane or one line. So now all four of these points here are all straight across from each other. And this is going to make things a little bit easy as we move on. The next step here is I'm going to grab all of the Bezier handles here, and just holding down the Shift key, I'm going to make all of these 90 degrees. I'm also going to push this one back just a little bit so it makes more of a curve there. For lines where I have 2 points but I don't have any handles, I'm just holding down the Option key. That will create those points, although it keeps it in a straight line. But again, just hold down the Shift key and make sure that everybody is in 90-degree increments there. And then the last thing that we're going to do is I'm just going to take the downward stroke here and then just bump it up against the curve there. There can be some overlap there if you'd like, depending on your typeface, but usually I just put it right up next to each other rather than having overlap. For me, that's just easier to deal with. The last thing I'm going to do, and this is just to start, is I'm going to take this center point here, and I'm just doing this visually. There's no real process to this, but I want to try and align this point as best I can midway between these two. And then the other thing that I'm going to do is take this point, and this gets a little tricky, but I'm going to try and align it midway between this point here, not this point, but this point, and this point over here. And I'm just kind of eyeballing this again. There's no rhyme or reason to this. But once I have all this set up, then effectively all I have to do is hold down my Shift key and then just start adjusting my my Bezier anchor points here. So just starting on the middle one, and then just kind of moving things around a little bit. Now that's going to get you pretty close to a pretty clean vector there. And what's nice about this is we have 3 shapes. We can manipulate each one of these individually if we like. There is a point where I may go, depending on the typeface, and merge all of these points together. Again, this just depends on the typeface and what my end goal is for it. The other thing that I might do is there's times where I might go back and like this point here, originally I started halfway between these 2 points, but it really wasn't working because now what I'm looking for is a smooth curve here. So now this just becomes going back and forth between my preview, just holding down the space, and then going back to the letter. Another thing you could do is just type out another letter next to it if you just want to keep an eye on it that way. Truthfully, the only reason that I do it the way that I do it is it's one of those old habits die hard kind of thing. But and then I'm just going to bump that whole thing down a little bit because I think 130 points was the other direction. So we'll just go through and try and get something close here. And that's probably pretty drastic, but that seems nice enough. The other thing that I might do is, now it just becomes a matter of breaking rules, and that's, for me, where the fun is in all of this. So it's about making smooth lines, smooth curves, and figuring out how to creatively break all of those rules I just told you. But generally speaking, that's going to get you a pretty decent looking N. And I might sit and play around with this a little bit more. You know, there's sometimes you might want to go through and if I just take the slicing tool here, pressing E on my keyboard, and if I just drew a little, actually not the slice tool, the pen tool, and drop a point there on my stem, you know, things like this are permissible if you need to go through and add additional points, but I usually try and keep it to a minimum because the next step here, I'm going to go through and just copy all of these and then doing a command 1 to flip over to my lightweight. Because now we want to go and make this a lighter style. So knowing that it was 130, I also know that the narrow weight was 36, it looks like. So it's going to go really thin. And I'm actually, that's one of the reasons that I wanted to use this typeface, because there is such a wide range between the two weights here. So you're really going to see why this is important here in a moment. So effectively, I'm just going to go through and just, again, push my points around here. And sometimes I grab too many points, but that's okay. But effectively, it's the reason that we want to have all of these things in 90-degree increments is you can see already how much easier it is just to be able, like all I'm doing right now is holding my shift key on my keyboard and moving these points around. And it's so much easier when you're moving things in 90-degree increments. You don't have to worry about you know, things looking goofy or you know, trying to figure out some wacky angle that you might just never get properly. So that's one of the big reasons that I like doing it this way. And then effectively it's just going through and just kind of cleaning up some of these curves here. Now naturally there probably are other better ways that I could go through and do this as well. But I found that this usually works for me pretty well, and in a few moments here you can see I'm getting something that, if I would say myself, seems fairly respectable. It probably still could use some work, but that's fine. That's, I guess you could say, to be expected. And things might shift around. It's just kind of the nature of the game. A lot of what typeface design is for me is, as much as it is about technical things and getting technical details right, it's also about creating optical illusions. You see this with things like overshoot, for example. You know, that's one of those things where a curve shape is going to look a little bit different in height, for example, than a square shape. So those are some things that I usually am thinking about and keeping in mind. But effectively here, as I get done droning on, you can see I have a pretty decent end there. And what's nice about the copy and paste thing here is that I was able to create this effectively with my my dimensions here. And looking along the bottom of the screen, I had some instances that I had already set up ahead of this video, but you can see that those are working correctly. My lightweight has 3 shapes. The curve is number 1, left stem is 2, the right stem is 3, and glyphs is showing me that that corresponds to the heavier weight as well. So we've got a pretty effective end there. It's a pretty clean end as well, and it effectively, I would say it's ready to go. You know, aside from actually tweaking things like I had mentioned earlier. But this is probably a pretty decent example of what clean paths might look like. Jumping over to the O, we'll just throw a quick O on screen here. So one thing that I do with the O, and this is going to be very glyphs-centric, what I'm about to show you here, but I figured it's worth mentioning or talking about, and I'm only going to do one weight for this, but usually with the O, I might go through and just kind of draw 2 circles here and just center everybody together. I'll actually just use the alignment palettes here, make it a little bit easier on me. Now, if I select these and do correct path direction, that'll actually punch the hole out for me. So earlier with the N, we had the opposite problem. but I'm able to use the same feature to get this to look correct. And then for this one, if I just take this outer one here, we'll just do a little bit of what I'm hoping will be quick math. So 550 minus 36. Let's see. You can't see this right now, but I'm actually using a calculator for this, just to make sure that I get all my numbers right here. But I promise I have a really cool trick here that I'm going to show you in a moment. So doing my math right, that is 478, which gets us the width. And then for the height, let's see, looks like we have about 530. That's a little bit easier math, so that means the height of this should be 470. And so the reason that I did that was now I've got my 30 there, my 35, well, if I were to get it right, there should be a 36 in there somewhere. But anyway, we're just going to go through, make sure everything's lined up. So each of my points here are right next to each other. Now, because I'm doing a vertical stress style typeface, this is going to be a little bit of a different approach than if you were to do a typeface that had an angled stress to it. That can be a bit of a can of worms. But for the sake of showing clean paths, I'm just going to keep this on the simple side, so that's going to be my caveat here. But with these two circles, usually what I'll do is select everything, and then going over to my fit curve palette here, I just let InDesign, I usually let glyphs do the work for me here. So I can use the fit curve palette to square it up a little bit if I want, and not make it such a geometric shape. Again, I'm just kind of pulling shapes out of thin air here. I'm not really trying to make a cohesive typeface here, because there would be some issues here with width and just kind of making some of these curves look right. But again, the same point stands, that something with an O here, especially with curves, that at each of the corners here, north, south, east, and west, that I have a point at each of those extreme angles. If this was going to be a typeface with some kind of stress to it, you might see some of these angles just shift over. And again, I'm just kind of doing a haphazard job here. It's probably a little bit difficult to see with such a thin weight here. But effectively, when you have a stress that is going to be going at any kind of angle, that's effectively what's happening with the O here, is you're seeing these points move around. And depending on the design of it, it might be one side or the other, that either the inside or the outside that's moving around. So, but ultimately, it's how you would draw an O. So. There you go. That's kind of some clean paths in a nutshell. One thing that I did want to touch on really quick was the S, because in all of the examples I've showed you, we've either dealt with straight lines or we've dealt with circular shapes or curved shapes. And usually what I tell you is that the fewer points, the better, but naturally you're always going to run into challenges with that. And I'm just pulling up the S here from my sans serif series, and I just wanted to talk a little bit about this, because when I was talking about extremes, a lot of those things were either closed shapes, or with the case of the lowercase n, there seemed to be kind of a natural start and stop point. The S takes a little bit of a challenge here. So what you'll notice if we go around this is effectively it's just a curved line is really what an S is. I know I'm not telling you anything new there, but one of the things that I have in this one is I do have my extremes here. I'm going to ignore this for a moment, but we've got, this point, this point, this point, this point on the bottom right here, the very bottom, and then the end of the curve. Now, when I would usually draw an S, I don't have that center point in there necessarily right away. Typically what I might do when I'm drawing an S is just focus on as few points as I possibly can here. And in some cases, depending on the design of your S, you may not need additional points beyond this if this is kind of a shape that you're going for. But every now and then you don't want the spine of your S here to be as fluid or as flowing. You might want to make it a little bit more rigid. And in that case, in a few typefaces, you'll often see type designers go in and they'll just add a couple of extra points here. And the reason that we do that is because we want to just include a little bit of extra control over these points or over these spaces. So if we want to have a more straighter spine, I guess for lack of better words, or just a little bit more control over how it's curving, that we have a few of extra controls that we're able to do that, or maybe we even want to move it up a little bit as well. So again, like with the thing that I've learned about type design is a lot of this is about setting rules, but it's also learning how to stretch your rules or to break your rules as well. And it's always not obvious when you're going through and doing something like this, particularly with the S. For a long time, I used to draw it without these 2 points in the middle. I saw somebody do it, and almost instantly it seemed to make my designs just feel so much better because I had some additional control there. So don't feel like you need to cram yourself into a corner if you're trying to follow these rules super rigidly. I think they're really good to keep in mind, particularly for the control characters, the cap H, the cap O, the lowercase n, and the lowercase o. Those are letters that are really conducive to these rules, but again, it depends on the design that you're going after, how your typeface is shaping up, and the style that you have going on. If you're watching my extended serif series right now, you'll notice that is a bit more of an unconventional typeface design, so it might need a whole nother set of rules. But again, generally speaking, try and get away with as few points as you possibly can, because quite simply put, if you're going to be doing multiple weights especially, it's just fewer points that you need to worry about. So hopefully this tutorial was helpful. I know I had fun making it, and to be able to talk about what makes a good path or a clean vector path. If you have any questions, or if you want me to dive into any more details about type design, be sure to hit the comment section below and let me know what you want to see. If you want some of these tips and tricks on a more ongoing basis, I currently have a newsletter called Letterform. I'll leave a link in the description below, but the website address is letterform.email, and twice a month, every month, I'm actually putting together tips like this in email form. So if you're just looking for these tips to kind of make them to your mind on their own, or you don't really have a question offhand right now, that's just a good way to kind of pick up on some of these things as well. But if you are enjoying this, if you're enjoying these tutorials, if you're enjoying my channel, by all means, I always say this in every episode, but it really does help if you haven't, to make sure to hit that like button on this video, and if you're not subscribed already, to go ahead and do that. And since we're in the spirit of giving, if you have any friends who you think might benefit from seeing some of this, or that they might be inspired by this channel or enjoy it, be sure to pass that along, because every little bit helps, and it sparks a lot of joy for me, to use a phrase, to be able to see people that are learning from these videos as well, and then even going on to create some of their own typefaces. So as always, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video.